The Putin regime has been widely exploiting the vulnerabilities of global social media platforms, using bots and trolls to promote specific stories and narratives. Now, there seems to be an increase in their activity of trolls, agents, fellow travelers, useful idiots, and grifters who post lies and distortions online in support of Kremlin narratives. Is this uptick in activity real? And what is its strategic purpose? The Silicon Curtain podcast has been created to explore issues around propaganda narratives and techniques and the threat they pose to open societies. If you enjoy the material we create and our fantastic speakers, then please do like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of these videos in YouTube. Pekka Kallioniemi has a PhD in interactive technology and is an expert on social media platforms, algorithms, and disinformation. He is a NAFO activist and runs a series on Kremlin assets, agents, and oligarchs called Vatnik Soup. There are now 70 entries, and it's some of these that we'll be discussing today. We'll also, of course, put a link into the description of this video so you can find out all about Vatnik Soup either on Twitter or on the website that Pekka has created. I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here. Maybe a little correction there. In a few days, there will be 100 Vatnik Soups.
100, fantastic. I definitely haven't read them all. I think I've read about sort of half of them, so I've still got quite a few to go. Well, let's start with Vatnik Soup because it's a great kind of entertaining but highly informative format. So how did it get started and really what was the inspiration for it?
So first of all, maybe a little bit background about my social media activity. So at some point, I've been quite critical of social media, these big tech companies, and how they kind of engage people through controversy. And I left basically all social media maybe 5 years ago. But then after Russia invaded Ukraine, I decided that, okay, maybe it's time to create some kind of channel where I can do something, because I kind of wanted to do something hopefully for Ukraine. And I just started tweeting. At first, it was very small scale. Then I kind of ran into the same discussion, same topics over and over again. So you had the biolabs, you had the Azov Nazis, and so on. And I thought that maybe there could be some kind of encyclopedia, Vatnik encyclopedia, or some kind of compendium of information where you could get hopefully vetted and validated information about different actors, about different themes, topics. And I started with Finnish, so-called Vatniks. So Finnish people who promote, spread, probably believe Russian propaganda and disinformation. So I started introducing these people. And yeah, that's how it started. And then at some point I focused more on international actors, and it just kind of exploded at some point, so, and became quite big.
And that's kind of that's an interesting sort of point to mention there, because way back, it seems like such a long time ago. Way back, almost a year ago, I did the very second interview in this series, and it was with Jessica Aro. And so she's a Finnish journalist, and she was hounded out of the country by a concerted campaign that was really run, obviously, by the GRU, but through sort of Finnish Vatniks, who created an atmosphere of sort of hate and distrust, which meant she had to leave because she was investigating the troll phenomenon and, you know, the architecture of the troll factories that exist in St. Petersburg. And, you know, one of the supposed key Vatniks there, I think his name is Johann Bachmann. I think he's, you know, he was quite influential and powerful. And he likes suing people as well. So let's hope, let's hope he doesn't watch this podcast. But do you think Finland's proximity to Russia meant that you were a key target for these so-called agents or Vatniks?
Definitely, yes. I mean, the Russian well, interference, for example, in politics, in business. It's a well-known thing in Finland, and we actually, there is an English term for it. It's called Finlandization. Is kind of when after the Second World War, we kind of constantly tried to appease Russia, so that the Soviet Union, so that there wouldn't be any conflicts, or there was this kind of atmosphere where we had to bow down to the Soviet Union, so that there wouldn't be any more trouble, because we lost the war, and we had to pay quite big reparations, and we still didn't want to kind of make them angry at us. So there was this atmosphere, and I feel like it's been there until February 2022, and then it kind of dissipated because of this invasion. Yeah, so I would say that Johan Backman is like the main person behind this kind of Russian disinformation campaigning and rhetoric. So yes, and of course there are others, but Johan Backman has been doing this for a long time, and I think he has over 100 court cases or lawsuits that he has done. So he's very active also in that sense.
And that's very expensive, of course. I mean, lawsuits are not a cheap activity. So it sort of hints at the funding that goes into that. I imagine that sort of funding trail is difficult to uncover. But let's turn to sort of Vatnik Soup, because you kicked it off after the invasion, the full-scale invasion, and it has grown massively, hasn't it? So what are the sort of key stats? And then, and what's been your sort of reaction to that? Because I think you've got 25,000 subscribers on Twitter now, 35 million impressions of the incredible content you've been putting out. As it started to build and evolve, what were your feelings towards it?
First, I think when it kind of exploded, I was just amazed how quickly it spread and how big it actually became. But there is actually an interesting thing that if you consider impressions and likes, it was more popular when I had about 500 followers than now, because I think there was some kind of algorithm at play. So maybe this pro-Ukrainian content was kind of promoted on Twitter, and then Musk took over, and then it kind of, the engagement went down about 40%. So I had less impressions, but yeah, of course now it's at good numbers again. I was amazed. I was like, I couldn't believe it. But then I realized that this format is very effective, because it's very. I wanted to create these soups that are very easy to digest. So you can read through them in a few minutes, but they still leave you thinking about the topic or the person that's been discussed in this particular soup. Because in let's just say that in the time of social media, we cannot put out really huge articles. People just don't. Their attention span is not long enough for this. So I feel like it kind of hit the nerve with the length and how kind of easily digestible the information is, but still it's very essential information.
And there's a good mix there of images and very sort of punchy information. And of course, the Twitter format is great because you can read one post or you can read the entire thread. So in that way, it's very easy to sort of scroll down and, fill your time by looking at it. Because it's so polished, because it looks very professionally put together. Am I correct in thinking it takes quite a lot of time to research and publish? I mean, can't be that easy.
Yeah, that's correct. So if, for example, we take Dimitri Firtash, I think it was 3 days ago, maybe I published that. It took me about a month. So I start slowly adding things up. I do a lot of reading. I read a lot of documents, court documents, and so on. So I want to be thorough in my research. Of course, I also make mistakes and then I correct them. Sometimes I publish misinformation, so I don't do it. I never do it intentionally. and whenever someone corrects me, I add a correction, of course. But yeah, it takes a lot of research, a lot of time. Also, I do a lot of, for example, if I'm cycling, I do a lot of, I listen to a lot of audio stuff and interviews, and it takes most of my free time, to be honest.
That sounds like we've got very sort of similar lifestyles there. Yeah, the video research has expanded also to fill an awful lot of time. Let's go into the kind of figures, because you mentioned Firtash, who is a Ukrainian. I think he's Ukrainian oligarch, isn't he? But you
Yes.
cover a lot of oligarchs. You cover, as you say, Vatniks, who are believed to be paid assets of the Russian regime. But what kind of figures, what kind of people have you covered to date?
So I think my favorite kind of genre or category is that these so-called independent journalists who are obviously paid probably by the Russian government. So these people who cover the war from the Russian point of view, because often their blatant lies are very well, not always easily, but often they are like revealed to be actual lies. So like they've staged things in Ukraine, and so I feel like they probably are my favorites. But I also like to kind of follow the money. So it's always interesting to see what kind of connection and networks there are between people around the world. So you take people like Konstantin Malofeyev or Firtash, Mogilevich. So they are often the source of the money, and then you can just kind of track this money through different networks and offshore companies, and for example Panama Papers and this kind of exposures of corruption and money laundering. They often bring a lot of information to the light in regards to these funding networks.
And it also brings names together, doesn't it? People who you might not have associated. Therefore, if you look at their messages and behavior in isolation, you might be convinced and thinking, well, I don't agree with them, but it's genuine. But these kind of court documents and these WikiLeaks style exposures, sometimes it puts two names together, which is what you need to make that connection to shed light on the particular narrative that they're peddling.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, it's to be honest, following the money, that's really hard work, and you often end up in a dead end. So you just kind of don't know where to go from there. But of course, there are other people fortunately doing this work, and we have a lot of discussions. I talk a lot with other journalists, researchers, and in general, people who are doing this kind of investigation. So it's always much easier to do things when you get some help and different perspectives also.
Do you have a team with you, or do you do the majority of your own sort of research and publishing?
I do everything on my own, but I have a lot of discussions. I have some sources. So yeah, everything, all the writing, everything is done by me.
Now, a lot of the people you're covering, Firtash and others, and especially some of the Russian oligarchs, Deripaska and those sort, they're extremely litigious, and they've got vast funds behind them. What we're finding at the moment is there are very few avenues open to Russian oligarchs in London to exert the influence that perhaps they had before the invasion began, but they're still able to use the courts to threaten journalists, to shut journalists up, to create incredibly expensive administrative processes that, even if they lose those cases, is still going to cost a lot of time and money and pain to journalists and to the publishers that put their books out. And people like Catherine Belton and others have had incredibly sort of painful experiences trying to defend their right to essentially sort of free speech and journalistic research. Is that something you fear at all from your work?
Not really. I feel like I'm kind of small scale actor here. Even though, of course, that Vatnik soups have become quite popular, but I still feel like why should anyone care that much about my little reports? But of course, I'm not. I don't rule it out. It might happen in the future, but I don't really think about it too much. I just want to deliver more soup.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I've been asked a similar kind of question actually, about whether I'm sort of worried as the channel takes off. But I think the difference now is there are so many opposition voices, aren't they? You've got so many journalists, writers who've been talking about this for years now. Their output of articles is much, much higher because it's a sort of central sort of topic of discussion. But you've also got most of the Russian liberal intelligentsia and opposition in the West producing huge media output. So perhaps sort of maybe 5 years ago, a rare individual like Jessica Aro would have been a prime target. Now, surely, there are just far too many people. They don't have the resource to threaten and follow up on all the critics of the Kremlin.
Yeah, I agree. I've been talking quite often about this Russian style of propaganda and disinformation called fire hose of falsehood, where you basically just use high volume multi-channel style of propaganda where you, for example, you post comments under news, for example, pro-US or pro-NATO news that you kind of fill it out with propaganda. This was a very common tactic applied by the Internet Research Agency, for example. But then NAFO came and it kind of turned the whole thing upside down. But yeah, I feel like Russia's resources probably our focus is probably right now in Ukraine, so they don't maybe have the resources to focus on these people who are criticizing them, and they kind of lost the media. I'm not going to say monopoly, but they lost their share of media in the West after RT and Sputnik were banned. So they are they've been kind of stripped of their weapons against this kind of criticism.
And of course, talking to a number of experts on the functioning propaganda, there's been a major change, which, up until February, propaganda has largely been about othering, your enemy, but it's also been about trying to create indifference. That is, to prevent people from taking action. And of course, there's been this incredible pivot this year, and especially since the announcement of the first overt conscription. Now, of course, there's a behind-the-scenes conscription going on, sort of unpublicized conscription, but on a vast scale. But the mechanic of propaganda has shifted to trying to make people take action. And that's only been partially successful. So I don't know what your thoughts are there, but I imagine it's taking a huge amount of their propagandistic resources to try and pivot and influence their internal audience rather than Europe.
Yeah, definitely. But there's this, if you think about this kind of timeline, so I think it was in September when Russia annexed these 4 areas in Ukraine, created these kind of puppet states. So that's pretty much the starting point of this kind of anti-war movement that started in the West, which is a propaganda weapon. So they started calling for negotiations and treaties, and so if I have this kind of a test to see if person is under the Russian influence, is if they called for negotiations before September, then they might be like legit. But if they started right after this Putin's announcement of the annexation, then probably they are kind of Vatniks who just promote Russian propaganda and Russian point of view. So yeah, there's this big anti-war movement that's trying to kind of activate people in the UK also and in the US?
I think that's absolutely fascinating because I know that almost everybody in NAFO, almost everybody who is engaging with these Russian narratives will have their own criteria for who they think is a Vatnik and who is a paid asset. And often it's quite easy. Sometimes it's a little more subtle than that. But as someone who's really sort of studied this in a much more sort of academic fashion, what is the key litmus test? Which narratives, as in addition to the sort of peace narrative, for you are a kind of red flag or indicator that somebody may be, pushing Kremlin storylines?
That's a good question, and I think there are still so many people who are not supported financially by Russia, but have been affected by their information operations. So there is a fantastic interview on YouTube. Yes, Yuri Bezmenov. Sorry about that. So Yuri Bezmenov interview about these information operations and how they are long term. So it takes years and years to demoralize people, to kind of, to brainwash them into different kind of thinking and worldview. And I feel like we now have a lot of people who've been affected for a long time. So it's this long-term operation that has created these so-called useful idiots who kind of promote the Russian propaganda and disinformation also. So to answer your question, it's almost impossible to say who's a paid asset and who is just a useful idiot or a Vatnik in a sense. So you just kind of have to reveal some kind of money transfers. So, for example, Janus Putkonen, who was actually my first Vatnik soup, target of my first Vatnik soup, there was this leaked email set that actually revealed payments from the Kremlin to him. So that's like, there's no denying that. But for many people, like Max Blumenthal or anybody from the gray zone, there really isn't any information about how they are funded, where do they get their money. But their rhetoric and their themes seem to fit this kind of mold that they might be paid by the Russians.
And of course, there are other ways, aren't there? I mean, some of this grift will generate money through other mechanisms because, there is, via the internet, stories that never would have sort of been published in mainstream media when we had a much simpler media environment. Now, with the sort of global reach of social media platforms, you will always find, an audience, even for the most absurd narratives, even if it's 0.01% of a population. If you take that as part of the global internet population, it's still a large number of people, and that brings revenue or can bring revenue by itself.
Yes, some of these conspiracy theories, they're often conspiracy theories. They become huge. If you think about QAnon, it's just people are still making a lot of money on QAnon related conspiracy theories. So you take Michael Flynn, who they do these like tours. Is it Reawaken America? So they go around America and talk about it's still the same themes, but they just removed the QAnon from there. And QAnon merchandise was huge. Somebody always makes money out of these. It doesn't have to come out of Russia, but Russia might be fueling these conspiracies. They might be like throwing fuel to the fire with their propaganda machines and troll farms. But usually, even if these people are not paid by the Russians, they can still kind of make a lot of money by promoting these ideas.
And this is something I've been talking to people who are quite sort of expert at big data, and I know you professionally, you will do a lot of research into the mechanics of social media, but there are starting to be tools that are able to say, okay, well, if you've got a number of people who are, pushing these narratives or flavors of them and amplifying those narratives, that actually using very large sort of data sets, you can go back and say, okay, well, they're not the originators of this narrative. So let's see if this is an organic phenomenon. Did this story arise in reaction to an event or a newspaper article or something that could more or less be seen as an organic activity? Whether those narratives are right or wrong, is it organic? Is it genuine? Or is it part of an orchestrated pattern, a campaign? Therefore, can you say that, there's all this stuff here, but actually, if we follow it back, we can see that there are some originators of this story and they're in X, Y, and Z location. Oh, and there seems to be a kind of, a certain orchestrated pattern to it because, they released these messages, immediately after something happening or some strategic pivot by the Kremlin. So, I mean, are you aware of this evolving ecosystem? And do you use any of these tools?
So yes. So if one example of this is some kind of a alternative headline pops up about it can be usually it's pro-Russian rhetoric, and then people find that okay, 10 people tweeted the same exact headline in like a span of half a minute or something. So this is something that people do quite a lot. So it's a like detective work, but there are actually very effective tools for this. So investigative journalist, Dutch Robert van der Noorda has a company called Troll Forensics, and they've done fantastic tool that can actually analyze tens of millions of tweets and kind of look for origins, look for organized activity, look for detect troll farms. So they've done this for a long time, and they've done a lot of work, for example, on the MH17 Malaysian Airlines down shooting. And we had a fantastic seminar just a few weeks ago in Finland where Robert told about this, their tool, and there are some very powerful tools that can be used to trace the origins of a message, for example. And they are very useful in looking for these patterns, looking for organized activity, looking for a troll farm-based augmentation of messages. And so, yes, unfortunately, we have tools for this kind of investigation.
Well, that's another potential guest on the channel. I'll reach
Definitely,
out to him because
yes.
that's fascinating. In the UK, Carl Miller is someone I've interviewed who also, through his Beam system, is trying to do similar analysis of large data sets to identify sort of patterns, geographic distribution of patterns and behaviors that underpin conspiracy theories, hate speech, and so on. And I mean, that brings me on to a point that you very powerfully made in one of your tweets, and that is where you analyzed the pillars of Russian propaganda, especially in time of war. And you listed 3 key factors that can characterize Russian propaganda, the sort of tone of it. One is hypocrisy, the other is cynicism, and lastly, as we've all seen on our screens, is extreme brutality. So could you talk a little bit about those pillars and how they work themselves out in the individual narratives?
So, basically I was talking about what kind of tweets, my tweets were the most popular. So those kind of that revealed some sort of hypocrisy. Usually it's people, for example, rich Russian people who send their kids to study in Europe or work in Europe. So that post was more about that, like what kind of themes are popular in my tweets. But yeah, hypocrisy is something that's often kind of mentioned when talking about the Russian oligarchs or politicians or Putin, for example. And then cynicism is something that's also a very big thing in Russian propaganda. It's basically what I mean by cynicism is that there is no kind of there are no moral values behind it. So what they do, for example, if we take, for example, Black Lives Matter movement. So Russia, based on fantastic research by the Stanford University, they fueled kind of both sides. So they rallied the Black Lives Matter protesters against so-called Blue Lives Matter protesters. So they organized rallies so that they were at the same time, and then kind of tried to create this confusion and internal conflict inside the US, so that maybe their focus would be more on the internal issues rather than foreign politics and Russian activities. So this is something where the cynicism is often very.
And that's an interesting one, isn't it? Yeah, because the people who are potentially sympathetic to Russia will see that, like, they'll look at the Kremlin support for these narratives, whether it's overt or beneath the radar, and they'll think that, well, these guys share the same values as me. So whether that is on the ultra-left, anti-imperialists, who talk about the sort of multipolarity and all these sort of nonsense geopolitical concepts, or whether it's talking about minority rights, gender issues, etc., persecution of LGBTQ, etc. Again, they'll look at the Kremlin and go, right, these are my people. They share the same values as me. So irrespective of whether they're, they are my enemy's enemy. But actually, the cynicism underlying it suggests that those who are peddling these narratives, the actual mechanics of it, the Kremlin doesn't believe necessarily in any of these things. They're just looking to latch on to weaknesses in the societies that they're wishing to divide and conquer.
Exactly, yeah. They're looking for the chinks in the armor all the time, like trying different narratives, and some of them work, some of them don't work at all. I honestly don't. It's hard for me to imagine why they are still pushing this biolab narrative, because it's just kind of ridiculous at this point. They've been ridiculed so many times, but they're still pushing it for some reason. But anyway, yeah. And to mention the third theme you said about the brutality, it's to me, it's so very obvious. Or, well, of course, I'm biased. I'm pro-Ukrainian in this conflict, and it becomes more and more evident when I read news about torture chambers or this kind of FSB tactics that they employ on the Ukrainian population. And I mean, it's very difficult to defend people who create a torture chamber for children. That's just I cannot even imagine. And castrations, torture, all kinds of violence towards the civilians. So yeah, the brutality is always there, and it's very difficult for me to imagine that there are people who kind of stay quiet on these topics. Often they are these propagandists or Vatniks. They don't talk about Russia. They barely mention Russia. They talk about Ukraine. They talk about West. They talk about Biden. They talk about Zelensky, but they never mention Russia.
Yeah.
Or if they do,
curious,
it's more like a side note.
That's it, and because they know there's nothing to defend. I mean, to an extent, I call that there's also the sort of Belarus strategy. There's a strategy for every sort of tone and flavor of opinion, and for people who are at different stages of understanding the conflict or misunderstanding it. The one which I think is called the Belarus stratagem, that is to say, okay, well, we've gone beyond the useful idiot. So here we have somebody who accepts that Russia is the aggressor. Possibly even that they've moved beyond the peace treaty sort of, the two sides Roger Walters argument. They've evolved beyond that, and you're starting to lose this person. And then Russia comes in with another narrative. And this is the Belarus stratagem, which is, right, we're the bad guys, right? We'll tell you, we're the bad guys. We're doing really bad stuff, but you can't win. So you might as well
Mm.
stop now because your loss is inevitable. Stop supplying armaments. Just give it up. We're not going to make a moral case for ourselves. We're awful, awful people, but we're stronger than you. So, I mean,
Yeah.
there's something for every psychological level, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah, and I would mention two names in this context. Scott Reeder, definitely one of these. Ukraine has no chance. Ukraine has lost the war, so on. And Douglas, I think.
Oh, yes. Is it it's McGregor? Is it Douglas McGregor?
Douglas McGregor, yes. Okay, I always mix it. Douglas McGregor, yes. So they are like, okay, I don't know where Douglas McGregor gets his information, but for example, he stated that Russia has 500,000 soldiers waiting across the border, and this kind of like nonsense that can be proved to be a lie in about 5 seconds with few Google searches, and they still do it, and they do it on national television, and it's like I don't know, maybe they don't have a reputation, but like the last bits of reputation, they are not even interested in defending that. They just tell
That
outright
works.
lies. It
That
works, yeah.
works. I mean,
Yeah.
I heard that figure of 500,000. I heard it yesterday on Times Radio. I heard it, I think, on Michael Naki and Ruslan Lviv. I heard it in 3 or 4 sources. This figure of 500,000 mobilized troops.
Hmm. Yeah, but
Um,
that was already, I think it was already in August when he
yeah,
started saying these numbers. But maybe it's still doing rounds.
it's still doing the
That's like
rounds. That's right.
go on. Sorry.
No, please, no, you continue.
No, I was just saying that we have these like military experts, Reader and McGregor, who are, have proven to be wrong on many occasions, but they still have a big audience.
They do, and Douglas McGregor, I think, has appeared on Fox, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
He does interviews with Judge Neapolitano. And people who get a very large audience, and you go back and you look historically at the videos they've put out, and he's been wrong about everything at every
Exactly. Yeah.
single stage of the war. And
Yeah.
yet, if you look at that individual isolated video, I've had friends who I've blocked because they repeatedly forward this sort of Vatnik nonsense and say, but you have to examine your prejudices. Look at this video. But what they don't look at, or what they ignore, is the context of narrative that goes back, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, even in the case of Flynn, several years. And I think you have to look at the narrative they're pushing now in the context of past behaviors, don't you?
Yes, I agree, definitely. I just wanted to check. So McGregor is actually one of my most popular soups, which has almost 1 million impressions. So yeah, it's still kind of amazing how if you think about again going back to McGregor and Reader, how they are like they still do occasional appearances on RT, and I think even on Sputnik. I think Reader is actually writing for RT right now. So they kind of do both sides, but they are still also appear often on Fox News. So it's so weird to me, like how does it how does it work, and why for example Tucker Carlson is so keen on promoting these pro-Russian views. That's something that kind of baffles me still.
I think it does. I think it baffles some of the people watching this as well, because I have a mixed audience. There are, very many people on the left and the right, as well as centrists, who watch this. My audience is typically about 25%, 30% from the US. So we have a huge range of political opinion. And a political opinion is absolutely valid. You may not agree with it, but absolutely valid to express a range of opinions. So I even have some MAGA Republicans who I've got into, I would say, very interesting and quite reasonable debates with. So it's challenged my own perceptions of the complexity of the political landscape. But I think even they are baffled why some of these commentators are pushing these narratives. But my experience in Russia and the phrase you mentioned earlier about following the money, there are no accidents, are there? So these can't be coincidences. If you see a pattern within narratives and you see repeated behaviors that are, aligned with one particular side, as opposed to trying to take a more sort of neutral stance, it's not accidental. It cannot be accidental.
No, yeah, I agree with that. So yeah, well, I just agree with that. I don't really
Yes,
have
there's nothing
anything
to
to
add
add,
to
add, add to that point. But I also want to say that my kind of audience is also very kind of spread on the political spectrum. I don't consider, for example, I don't consider my tweets political. I try to kind of I my focus is on the truth, and that's, for me, truth is the ideal, and I always try to go towards that ideal. So I kind of try to talk about bullshit. Sorry about the language, but I try to detect bullshit when I see them, and then call on it. I don't really talk about this kind of left-right division, and I've even stopped talking about. I don't often mention, for example, far right, or because it means different things in different countries. So, just an example: if you think about political left in the US, that would be probably still on the kind of right spectrum in Finland, because it's very socialistic country, as all Nordic countries are. So it's I don't think there is this universal. We can always think about ideas on the left, ideas on the right. There's like this general, but still making too many generalizations on this kind of spectrum is, in my opinion, quite pointless.
And it alienates part of your audience, doesn't it? And I think what's interesting about your Vatnik soup, and what I've started to learn about the videos I'm doing, is that if you get the tone of them right, if you get the sort of questions right, you can attract an audience from across the political spectrum, and you can engage with a whole range of people. And it's been, I think, a long time since people were able to come together over issues and accept that they have differences in some areas, and see eye to eye in others. That is another gift of Putin to an extent, isn't it? In that he's so extreme. The violence is so overt and so immoral that he has at least partially made us sort of perhaps focus back again on our core values.
Exactly. I mean, I feel like Putin has kind of brought the West together in this, and it seems that for at least for a while, probably just for a while, we have this kind of common consensus on things, and this common idea of what is wrong, what is right thing to do. And obviously the right thing to do right now is to just support Ukraine as much as they need our help. So I don't think
suggests, that suggests as well. Now, I've spoken to many people in Ukraine who haven't just been fighting Russian disinformation, since February. They've been fighting it since 2014 and even earlier. And so they've tried and tested many techniques and technologies. And I think the conclusion seems to have been, from speaking to many people, is that firstly, there's no single solution to countering disinformation or aggressive informational assault. So you need a range of different techniques. But I think the one common factor that's come through is you can't fight propaganda with propaganda. You can't fight propaganda with lies. That just builds a huge amount of distrust and cynicism, and actually amplifies the propaganda itself. So all the messages that various people have told me is that what you have to focus on is your own values, your truth. You have to remove hypocrisy from your own behaviors, and focus more on things like media literacy, correct information. So really kind of exactly the kind of stuff that you're doing. You're combining both of those things, trying to deconstruct narratives, present factual information, make it entertaining. Did you do that consciously, or has it sort of, you've touched upon a really powerful solution almost by accident?
I think it's mostly accident, but maybe a little more background on me. So I've been using computers since I was 4. I've connected to the internet before it kind of even existed. So like this pre-internet bulletin board systems, and even then back then there was a lot of disinformation spreading throughout these kind of networks, and even back then it was something that kind of made me act. So I wanted to invalidate these theories and these arguments. So it's been following me for a long time, and I feel like I'm finally doing the thing that I do well, that I've been doing for such a long time. So now with this Vatnik Soup series, I feel like I've found kind of my mission on fighting this information. But I also want to kind of thank the Finnish system. That's also in Finland we have a very good system for fighting disinformation already on in schools. We are taught about this, like media, learning what kind of medias. I'm looking for the word, but anyway, like this media literature. How well okay, maybe cut that part, but
yeah, can do.
So I think what is the word when you kind of learn how to detect bullshit on media?
Literacy, basically, I guess, sort of digital literacy.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, I'll go from there. So in the Finnish system, from the very young age, we already learn this digital literacy skill where you kind of learn how to detect bullshit from media. And we also have a lot of projects that revolve around this. So I'm not sure, do you have this kind of service, security of supply term in UK? So for example, how big percentage of your food comes from UK? Do you have this kind of
Possibly, yeah. I mean,
okay.
maybe there's a department of Whitehall somewhere that frets about it and loses sleep. It's not. I don't think it's hugely well known.
Okay. Well, in Finland it is, and we are very proud of it. So we try to make the percentage as big as possible. I think it's about around 80 now. So that in case of a disaster, 80% of the food produced will be coming from Finland. So now these days we are also utilizing this kind of thinking to information. So in case of, for example, invasion, how can we secure the information flow that it's not influenced by foreign actors or any kind of this for example, troll farms. So we have projects that study this kind of thinking, and I'll also be involved in one of these projects. So very interesting stuff. So for a long time, we've been looking into the information flow and how to make it as secure as possible, and so that it's not influenced by foreign actors.
And that's an incredibly powerful idea. I don't know if we have an equivalent here at all. Certainly, if we do, it's not that effective because there is clearly a lot of influence. I would say even oligarchic influence with very sort of lack of transparency about the connections and interests that underlines a lot of our media here. Ukraine seems to have understood this message finally. After the 2014 invasion, perhaps they understood it quite sort of late in this process, but they seem to be following what you're describing there by consolidating the media, removing oligarch influence from the media holdings, preventing oligarchs from actually being able to own substantial or controlling stakes in large media companies, but also they have been, they've been accused of being illiberal here, but they have realized that any territory where Russian media has a presence, usually it's a majority presence because they tend to be quite monopolistic. And in those territories, you have a process of brainwashing taking place. So they've been consistently now removing Russian media influence from their social environment, seeing it as a direct national security threat. And it's great that sort of Finland, Ukraine, and the Nordics are understanding this, but it's not universal, is it? There are many countries in Europe even where this kind of policy is not taking place. And in fact, going back to your phrase there, chinks of armor, there are some significant areas of weakness out there. And when we think immediately of Hungary, Serbia, Italian media landscape is also highly penetrated by Russian narratives, I believe. So what's your take on the wider issues in Europe?
I think there are some initiatives on the EU level to fight this. I would also mention Austria as one of the, and Slovakia, definitely where there's a big media influence coming from Russia. So I think it's a huge question how to kind of fight this issue, but there needs to be some kind of thorough investigations on these networks. And again, the reason people should follow the money again, because without Russian funding, there is probably no Russian influence. It becomes minuscule right after that. And I wrote a column for the Byline Times a while ago about how Russia started this economic war against the Europe already back in 2007. How they kind of made many European countries dependent on the services and money from Russia. And we're still kind of paying that price, even though we are kind of deconstructing that system, have been for a while after the invasion. But I feel like after that economic dependency, political dependency kind of winds down, then we can see, hopefully we can see more kind of free journalism and democracy, and this kind of aspects become more prominent in these countries.
Well, that's an unusually positive place to end on. Normally my videos end in a very pessimistic place. But I think, having something to latch on to, some positive sort of action, and I think that's incredibly important to move forward with clear plans of action on how to improve things. And I highly recommend people check out your Vatnik soup. It's hugely entertaining as well as informative. We'll put links to that, obviously, in this video description. And Pekka, I've been looking forward to this for a while, having sort of read your materials, and it certainly didn't disappoint. It's been a great pleasure.
Yeah, it was great fun. I'm so glad that we finally found time for this.
Yeah, no, really
Thanks.
good. And we'll publish this up later today, and I know the audience are going to love the material and and really enjoy the stuff that you put out. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thanks.